Welcome, everybody. My name is Stacy Matrazo. I'm the Executive Director of the Florida Wildflower Foundation. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Native Plants to Attract Wildlife. For those of you not familiar with our organization, our mission is to protect, connect, and expand native wildflower habitat through education, research, planting, and conservation programs. Our work is made possible primarily through the sale and renewal of the state wildflower license plate. This is our original look. We now have an updated look. Whether you have the old license plate or the new, you are supporting our projects and we thank you. These funds from the license plate, along with donations and memberships, allow us to support and create projects that build awareness and knowledge of native wildflowers and plants throughout Florida. We'd like to encourage those of you who find our programs valuable to consider becoming a member, making a donation, or purchasing the state wildflower license plate. You can find out how to do that at our website, flawildflowers.org/support. If you do purchase the license plate, please let us know. You are eligible for a membership with that tag. You just need to tell us that you have it, and we'll get you set up as a member in our database. Be sure to check our website for resources on planting and growing wildflowers, to learn where to see wildflowers in bloom, to learn about our upcoming events and more. We're also on social media. You can find us on most platforms. We've got some great webinars lined up in May. We've got Claudia Larson to talk about plant propagation. And in June, we've got Lily Anderson Messick with the Florida Native Plant Society to give us all the information we need to know on Florida's native milkweeds. We also have some great field trips. We do at least one a month, sometimes multiple. Next one is in Pine Glades Natural Area. This one is sold out, but you can sign up for the waiting list on our website. And due to the popularity of our Wildflower Farm Field Day, we are offering 2 dates this year. May 13th and 14th, you'll have the opportunity to see a field of wildflowers in bloom. Farm owner and Florida Wildflower Foundation board member, Terry Zinn, will talk about wildflower farming and lead the group on a tour of the farm. You can have your picture taken in a beautiful field of coreopsis and just learn what's involved in that. Register for either day on our website. And again, make sure you follow us on social media, and sign up for our newsletter to make sure that you are kept up on all the things that we've got going on. I do have a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees are muted with cameras off. We are using the Q&A feature for questions, so please submit your questions anytime during the presentation. We will take some time at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as time permits. If your question is not answered, you can email it to us and we will make sure that we get the answer you are looking for. Also, this webinar is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel and our website in about 24 to 48 hours. You will also receive an email with a link to the recording once it is available, as well as resources from today's presentation. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Tina McIntyre is the Florida-friendly landscaping agent at the University of Florida IFAS Extension in Seminole County. She specializes in surface water quality and quantity, best management practices related to landscape management, and restoration of urban green spaces. Tina came to Extension after serving 4 years as the Senior Biologist on the Water Sciences team at the Orange County Environmental Protection Division, where she surveyed the lakes, rivers, and streams of the county and worked in the laboratory. Before that, she worked for 6 years at the University of Central Florida Arboretum. During her tenure there, she also formally and informally taught students on a variety of topics, including ethnobotany. While working at UCF, she completed her master's in conservation biology with an internship with the Florida Native Plant Society in 2013. Since coming to Extension, she's been honored with prestigious state and national awards, including the Art Hornsby Professional Enhancement Award for Water and Soil Sciences and the 2021 Florida Friendly Landscaping Agent of the Year. Without further ado, I will hand this over to Tina.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stacy. I really appreciate you and the Florida Wildflower Foundation having me today to explore this topic. And I'm just getting set up here so you can see my screen. So today we're going to be talking about native plants that are going to attract wildlife. So without further ado, I will go ahead and get started. So I am with the University of Florida IFAS Extension, and I just wanted to, if anybody's not familiar with Extension, we're basically an extension of the university, and we're here to offer the science for horticulture, agriculture, youth education, nutrition education. So if you're not familiar with your local extension office, look them up and check it out. I do have a quick survey. I'll show this at the end, and you can definitely look out. I have some QR codes, and I believe they'll be chatting the links as well. So just to kick it off, why Florida-friendly landscaping? Well, it is actually in the state law, and it's codified in the 9 principles. We're going to be touching on a couple of these today. But essentially, right plant, right place is the foundation. Even if we're talking about native plants, there are some aspects that they prefer, right? Their evolutionary preference. So we want to think about those aspects. And then also today, along with these other ones that are always great to support wildlife and water quality, water conservation, we're going to be talking really about attracting wildlife. And so how can we foster that wildlife in our yards? So as we look at our state here, Florida, we actually have this report that was put together by the Thousand Friends of Florida in conjunction with the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services and the UF GeoPlan Center. And they created a 2010 baseline for developed areas. And that's what we're showing here on the left in red. And then when we look out to 2070, we're seeing quite a lot of development going on in our state. And this is apparent no matter where you're driving around. We're seeing new neighborhoods, and quite a bit of our protected or green spaces are, starting to diminish. And so, there are some alterations or, adjustments to this study that they're looking at. But if we continue on the path that we've been on since 2010, we do see quite a bit of land being converted to developed impervious surfaces in urban areas. And this can cause a big issue for our wildlife, right? Fragmentation is really what we're looking at when we have roads or strip malls, neighborhoods, converting that wildland or that green space into urbanized areas. We have, inhibitors to dispersal, and that can apply to plants, to wildlife, all of our native species, really. We also increase in automobile collisions. So we all know that with our charismatic megafauna, our black bears and our Florida panther, but, other animals as well. And then when we create small fragments of land, we do see this edge habitat occur. And essentially what that is when we have a small parcel, the edge of that parcel is going to be kind of less quality habitat, and it just becomes kind of an opportunity for invasive species. And so we're not only seeing smaller fragments of land, but lower quality of that area. And of course, then we have human interactions and conflicts that can occur within the urban wildland interface as well. So, Florida-friendly landscaping is really a big part of the solution as we look out into the future of Florida. Your backyard to create a habitat is really integral for many species to be able to overcome a lot of these challenges that they're faced. So we want to think of many things as we're thinking about our yards, our communities, our neighborhoods, schools, church grounds, these types of things as opportunities, and think about it in a way logically that, how are we going to design this landscape? What wildlife are we trying to attract? What are their needs? Current site conditions. So is it, wet? Is it dry? Do we have sun? Is it shady? The current site conditions and, the realistic plant options. So there are, even though we're all working very hard to foster a lot of these native plants, they can be really limited as to accessing them. So what are some plant options that we can integrate? And again, the various types of wildlife that we might be willing to attract are going to be very diverse and connect to the items that we're planting and the species that we're planting. So if we're looking for, birds, different types of birds, right? We have our birds of prey. We have here this hummingbird, right? Different types of birds that eat insects or seeds. So there's so much diversity, even just within attracting birds. Of course, our insects or butterflies and our bees, right? Butterflies, as I'll talk about later, are very specific to what they can rear on. And so we want to, make sure we're picking those species if we're looking to attract them. Various types of pollinators, which ranges the gamut, small mammals, and then, even things like bats, right? We have them at night and kind of at dusk, we see them popping out. So it all really begins with right plant, right place. So we want to think about these concepts of right plant, right place. So again, site conditions and aspects of that species. And our state is very diverse. So when we look up to North Florida, we're seeing, possible freezes occur during the winter. Central Florida can be hit or miss, right? Depending on where you live, where you're, trying to grow this landscape. Central Florida is extremely diverse. You might be in a microclimate and you can grow some tropical stuff, but you might be exposed to more cold areas. So really knowing your zone, knowing where you're at is really important. And then again, in South Florida, very different also. They are tropical 100% of the time. So they might get a little cold snap, but they can reliably plant things that are designated as tropical plants. So we better understand this when we look at the cold hardiness zones of specific species. And when you, research a plant or purchase a plant, it should tell you, or at very least you can always look up the EDIS publication to learn more. But we do have these cold hardiness zones throughout the country, throughout the state. And knowing your zone is really important because if you're planting something, again, more cold sensitive, it's going to be susceptible to freezes should we get them. And then if you're planting something that, in the opposite, it's also might not work out. So just knowing these cold hardiness zones is important. And then today we're focusing on, native to Florida. And so the general accepted definition of a Florida native plant is something that refers to a specific species occurring within the state boundaries prior to European contact. So that's according to the best available scientific and historical documentation. Now, as science evolves and changes and we gather new information, of course that can change. So, science is kind of a malleable and ever-changing process. But this is the best that we have, right? And not that plants didn't, of course, move around and permeate prior to that, but this is really, Florida Native Plant Society, and most people kind of accept this definition. We also want to think about the growth rate, height, and spread. So certain trees or plants might grow very vigorously. They might grow super fast and, create, not as hard or dense of wood, for example, for trees, or they might grow a little bit slower, right? And some of our native plants grow fast or they might grow slow. So just knowing that in terms of your landscape design and, what your goals are is important. Then we think about the mature height in feet. And, we think about the mature spread of the plant, right? So some plants are going to be more ground cover. Some plants are going to get quite large, but you'd be surprised, especially with tree plantings, we do have issues with being able to, people plant trees under power lines. And so really thinking about proximity to resources, your home, your septic tank, various things is really important when you're thinking about right plant, right place. And then proper pH. So doing a basic soil test can be really helpful especially in our newer developments where we see all kinds of numbers from our pH. Just a quick recap, because, you know, maybe it's been since high school since we've thought about pH, right? Acidic is very low on the scale. So 1, ranging all the way to 14, which is considered highly alkaline or basic. So most of our soils or plants kind of fall within this kind of yellow-green range, right? Our soils in Florida tend to run slightly acidic, so in the 4 to 5 to 6 range. Some of our others tend to like it, you know, within the 6 to 7 range, but there's exceptions, right? Our native azalea likes it acidic, and we have a lot of natives that do prefer the acidic soils that they evolved in. But some of our newer developments might actually, we've seen 8s and 9s in that alkaline area. And the problem is if the pH is off for that specific species, they're not going to be able to absorb the nutrients that are in the soil naturally, or ones that you apply as a fertilizer, either in a compost or a synthetic blend. So we want to know that our pH is perfectly aligned with our plant species, and those nutrients are going to conduct into the plant roots as we prefer. Another aspect of our soil that we want to think about is the particle size. And so some parts of Florida have some clay. Those are going to be bigger kind of areas there. We also have, of course, sand. Most of us are going to have pretty much sandy soils, right? Because we used to be the bottom of the ocean floor, and so we've inherited a lot of sand throughout our state. But you might have a mix, and so, you know, kind of feeling your soil and seeing what you have is also important for drainage issues. And that makes us think about soil moisture, right? So if it's, you know, it could be well drained to wet. So you want to think about, when it rains, do you have standing water, or does it kind of percolate out pretty quickly? Is there organic matter in the soil? Do you have, you know, have you added mulch or compost or manures to your local area? You know, do you have, of course, we all have rain, but do you have an irrigation system? What are the sources for irrigation for watering the site? Even if you're going native, you know, establishing these plants is critical, especially this time of year when we don't typically have a lot of rain and it's windy and dry. So we want to make sure that we're establishing our plants and not just planting. Even just this week, I saw some plants planted and it turned brown immediately because they were not cared for. So thinking about using that irrigation to establish and supplement during times of drought. And then erosion, you know, as we get these heavy rains in the summertime or hurricane season, are we having a lot of erosion on the site? These are just things to consider for your site conditions. And then as we look to the plant species, what is the drought tolerance of the plant? You know, is it a high drought tolerance, like our succulents, maybe medium drought tolerance, or others low, just naturally have evolved in shady, wet, you know, wetland type areas, and they prefer more, you know, water in general. So what are the aspects of that plant that might align well to your site, or might make it really a no for your site conditions? We also want to think about the light range and light optimum for plants. You know, we cannot force a square peg into a round hole, right? We learn that as toddlers. So we don't want to do that with plants. We want to consider the optimal range of light for that species we're trying to grow, and then we'll have so much better luck after that. So when we're talking about full sun, we're talking about 6 hours or more of direct sunlight per day. When we're talking about partial shade, that's going to be 3 to 6 hours of direct sunlight per day. And then full shade is actually going to be 3 hours or less. Okay, so, you know, 2 hours if it's deep shade, you know, might get some dappled shade throughout. So, you know, kind of adding it up. And then again, thinking about the seasons, right? So we have very short days during December, right? the sun setting close to 5:30. So we're thinking about, getting that light optimum all aspects of the year and all aspects of the season. So now that we've kind of considered our site conditions, considered, some aspects of the species that we might be thinking about, we want to think about the aspects of creating habitat. What do animals prefer? So habitat is actually the collection of resources required by each species of wildlife for its survival. So we kind of break it down to food, water, cover, and space. And so I'll kind of go through these four aspects, breaking it down a little bit. And again, for each species, that's going to look a lot different. You can see here I have the waxwing, eating a berry. Obviously, frogs are going to be more looking for insects, and so on and so forth. So it's not necessarily considered habitat if we're missing some of these parts and pieces. And not that you necessarily have to have all of these in your yard, but it's just something to think about. Maybe you're close to a water source. Maybe your neighbor has some shrubbery that could be considered cover for the animal you're targeting. But just thinking more on a landscape scale, a neighborhood scale, and do these animals have access to this resource? So for food, to start off, essentially, we want to think about what food the plants produce and who will eat it. This is obviously very basic and intuitive, but if we have a lot of acorns on site, then we might be attracting things like wild turkey, squirrel, raccoon, deer. And I think about here where I live in Central Florida, and basically we do have a lot of oak trees, and so our squirrels are very happy to ignore a bird feeder every once in a while. But I go out to the beach in the coastal areas and, there's a lack of acorns, and my sister can't keep a bird feeder to save her life, and that's because there's not as much resources in those acorns. And so it really does kind of adjust the behaviors of those small mammals. So again, even thinking about on a landscape scale, what resources do these animals have access to? For example, if we're going to plant hollies, then we're, probably going to be targeting some songbirds like our cardinals, our mockingbirds, things like that. Bright fruits are meant to attract wildlife, attract birds, right? So thinking about those details. Sorry, I was just looking at making sure everybody can see my screen.
Yeah, I can see your screen. I'm not sure why others wouldn't be able to.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm not seeing too many comments, so I'll just keep continuing. All right. So how would we attract a bird of prey? And feel free to kind of put in the chat if you have some ideas or comments here, as I slowly kind of release my thought processes behind these, right? And of course, birds of prey exist throughout our state, and they might just be doing well. But if we wanted to target the species, what might be a good way to do that? Well, here's, for example, one of our hawks. So let's put up a compost pile, right? A well-maintained compost pile that is going to be turned and not have lots of open and exposed stuff, right? But even so, we're probably going to get a few little critters coming around every once in a while to check it out. And that might actually provide food for our hawk, right? Let's say we plant some mulberries or plant some edible berries. Those are going to bring in some songbirds, right? Like we talked about with the holly. And so birds of prey actually eat other birds, right? That's part of their diet. So if we bring that in, then we're probably also going to have maybe a little garden snake, a little black snake. And so the hawk would happily enjoy the mouse, the cardinal, or the black garden snake there. So we're kind of allowing, these small mammals, small reptiles, small birds to come into our yard and then support the food web above them. And, hawks can be such a wonderful addition to our neighborhood communities, right? We also want to think about seasonality. So what time of the year is the food produced? So staggering that food production is something that's always, readily available for that animal or for various animals. So in spring, we might have, some seeds being produced or some, blossoms for the pollinators. In fall, we might have some fruits. And then other things that might be pretty year round, pretty reliably, fruiting most of the year, depending on where we're living in the state. We also want to think about the size of the fruit or the plant, product, be it a seed or a fruit, because many birds, for example, have very differently shaped beaks. And so a catbird, for example, can eat things that a pine warbler might not be able to. And so just thinking about, again, if you're looking to target a very specific species of bird, what's the shape of their beak? What, is their diet usually consist of? Another example would be our Carolina wrens. They're pretty much 95% insectivores, right? They want insects as opposed to a bird feeder or a berry bush. And so we're going to need to get a little bit more creative with fostering insects in our yard to attract those Carolina wrens. And then abundance. So if we have one particular species that's extremely productive, and I would say beautyberry is pretty productive, right? It's that Calicarpa americana native that we see. And it's usually not the first go-to for many wildlife. I know I do see it hanging out a lot in our wilderness areas, but they'll eventually get to it because as the scarcity increases, they get less picky, right? Just like we all do, right? But if this plant is producing in abundance, maybe you only need one in your landscape, and then you can enhance that diversity with other species. And we want to think about the taste too. If it tastes good to us, then it's possible that it's going to taste good to them. And so for things like this, we want to think about if we do have a bird feeder, making sure it's clean, making sure that it's, once that food gets moldy, we're removing it. Because that's actually not desirable for them, and they're going to stop coming around once we see that. Targeting invertebrates specifically. So building a healthy and productive invertebrate food base will increase the wildlife higher up the food chain. So like I talked about with those Carolina wrens or other species as well. So thinking about larval food plants, so attracting those caterpillars. We have, targeting our native species. We talk a lot about integrated pest management. So we're not doing any routine pesticide application. That's really important. And I know if you're a member of the Florida Wildflower Foundation, you're likely not doing that, which is great. But, when we use insecticides on a routine kind of chemical application, we do kill our native pollinators and our other insects as well, our good bugs. So we want to be conscious of that. Planting flowers, of course, is a great way to attract our invertebrates. But also our barks, right? A lot of things can live under pine bark or other types of bark, and our leaf litter. So even if you don't have a ton of room for trees, just utilizing mulch or leaf litter that are decomposing there is going to create a lot of insects in the soil structure. And also some of our insects actually like bare open soil. So even though that's not really great for erosion purposes, if you do have a little soil exposure, that can be good for certain types of insects as well. And then thinking about our water resources. So, if you're in Florida, it's very possible you're close to some water. But is it fresh water, right? Most of our wildlife is going to need that fresh water. So you might be close to a lake or a stormwater pond, but you could also consider a little bird bath for things to kind of come over. Or if you're even thinking about like for the butterflies, a puddling station for them. So again, just depending on what animal you're trying to target, that might, dictate what kind of water you want to provide. And then for cover and space. So the cover and space, which is, for example, this saw palmetto here, It might be, something where they can fly openly or kind of roam openly, but it's also going to protect them from predators, right? They can hide in this thicket, and the hawk may or may not be able to get them because they can kind of cover away, right? Now, the cover should correlate to the amount of food and water available. So if you have a ton of food, a little bit of water, you kind of want to think about too how much vegetation as cover that you want to also provide. And this is actually really important when we think about like our bird species. A lot of them won't even come into the yard to get food if there's not enough foliage for them to hide from various predators. And I'll talk more about that later. Another really easy thing that we can do is that if we do have a tree fail, a tree death on our property or in our neighborhood, is consider leaving it, right? If we don't have any, immediate threat to life or property with the dead tree, then we want to think about leaving it for our woodpeckers and our wood burrowing owls, like we see here in the picture. A lot of animals will actually get the insects from the dying and decaying wood. So that's just an easy thing to think about. I know this can be challenging, if you live in an HOA or those types of things, but perhaps if it's in the backyard or close down by the lake, it might not be a big concern. And so just a specific slide here on a couple slides on butterflies, right? A lot of people get really jazzed about planting pollinator gardens, and that's wonderful. And, those are really an easy target for us to start with, but building that foundation of the food web, right, is enhancing those pollinators. Well, we want to think of not only those charismatic adults and the beautiful butterflies that we have here in Florida, but also the caterpillars, right? We want to have those host plants that are home and food for our caterpillars that eventually develop, of course, into the butterfly. The larvae will consume its body weight in host plant material every 2 days. So if you ever read that Hungry, Hungry Caterpillar book, that is so true. They really do need quite a bit of foliage and leaf material to be able to gestate into an adult. And then of course when they are an adult, we want to provide a variety of color, shapes, sizes, and bloom periods for those nectar plants. Just a quick note about monarchs, if you are interested in kind of targeting butterflies. In 2020, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed the monarch as endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act, that it was warranted but precluded by higher priority listings. And so they did do an extensive status review that they compiled. They assessed current and future status. And the monarch is now a candidate under the ESA, but it will be reviewed annually. So it's something that's beginning to get traction, right? I don't believe it's currently listed. And so it is something that they're obviously looking into and compiling reports about. So in the meantime, we want to support them, right? We know that there is a bit of a concern around this species, and we want to, plant for the monarchs. And it sounds like y'all have a great milkweed webinar coming up this summer. So definitely check out that milkweed presentation later this year. We also have a brand new EDIS publication. As I mentioned, I like QR codes, so I just threw them in here, but they also will chat the link kindly there. And we have a new EDIS publication about the tropical milkweed. I know there's a lot of interest in this and kind of confusion. So we do talk a little bit about its invasive status, what to do, how is it acceptable? So check that out specifically there. And as we're talking about attracting wildlife, we also want to think about bears. Throughout our state, we have the Florida black bear, and even within our county here in Seminole, we have a bear ordinance area, which is the western part of the county along the Wekiva River. We have quite a bit of bear population there, bear interactions. And so if we're thinking about, creating habitat and attracting wildlife, if we're in a bear prone area, we just want to be mindful of this. We don't want to be planting a ton of things that will bring the bears into our yard and cause possible, again, wildland urban interface, problems. Because usually if these bears come into urban areas, it's not always a great ending for them. And so we want to think about, our surroundings, and just if that is a problem in your area, just be conscious of, your compost piles, your berry trees, that might not be a great option for you, even bird feeders. And utilizing those bear-proof trash cans is really important. And managing pets. So studies indicate that free-ranging domestic cats annually kill anywhere from 1 to 4 billion birds and 6 to 22 billion mammals. That's quite a bit. But, just walking around my neighborhood, I know I frequently will see them catching squirrels or a dead mole here and there. And it does add up. So, these cats, feral, domesticated, can actually cause quite a dent in our goals to attract wildlife and foster habitat. So, we don't recommend encouraging strays, keep those cats indoors or screened in porch. There's also a cat bib product that's been studied where you can actually, if the cat has to be outside for some reason, put the bib on it, and it actually will, if it's, lunging at the animal, it'll inhibit it from, probably being able to kill that animal. And of course, don't release any exotic pets. As we know here in Florida, invasive species are an issue. So now I'm going to kind of run through some of the specific plant species that are going to be good for those full sun, part sun, and full shade areas. And you may or may not be familiar with them, but again, this recording will be available. So if you, miss a few, that's okay. You can always go back and cheat later there. But for our large trees, we're thinking about pine trees, right? Florida has been so rich with pines, and thinking about longleaf, slash, loblolly, sand pine. Also the sycamore, it's in full, vegetative glory right now after its deciduous hiatus. This is a great tree for, creating that shade canopy. Also turkey oaks, they give a nice pop of color in, the later time of the year. So that's a good one to consider. And our cypress trees, of course, for more wet areas, or even our oak trees, right? We talked about the acorns and various aspects there. What about medium trees? Well, we have our eastern redbud, which is gorgeous, of course, in the springtime when it pops out its nice reddish pinkish flowers there. We have the southern red cedar, which is great. Those are both great for dry, more kind of scrubby areas. We have the Dahoon holly, which is a wet plant. Typically, it actually does quite well in dry areas, dry landscapes as well, but we usually see it in wet parts of Florida. We have mulberries and Chickasaw plums that also provide those, berries that we're looking for small mammals or birds. For small trees, we have baccaris or salt myrtle, and you can see some monarchs here on that. Typically this is going to be native to more coastal areas of Florida, but it grows well all throughout the state. We have our wax myrtle that can be kind of hedged into something or grown more freely. It can become a shrub or shaped into a small tree. So lots of flexibility there. And it does have nice little waxy berries that are desired by wildlife. We have the wild olive, which is, a wonderful Florida native plant with lots of, it has a rhododendron look to it a bit. So if you're kind of looking to recreate a little bit more northern feel, that could work. Thinking about large shrubs, we have our pawpaw, which is actually edible. Now this one might be a little harder to find, might be a little harder to grow, but you can see the white behind it is, of course, not snow, it's Florida sand. So it does like it very high and dry. Has beautiful, almost orchid-like looking leaves there in the spring, and then followed by those fruits. Thinking about our ground covers, so we have twin flower, and there are a couple different species of the twin flower. So just knowing that one is really more for wet areas, and one are for dry areas. And so asking those questions when you're purchasing the plant, depending on what your site needs are. And so the ground cover is here nice and green, and then a close-up of the little purple flowers there, very cute. Our junipers, shore or creeping junipers, those could be a nice slow growing addition. We have our railroad vine, which is native to our Florida dunes, and that's going to be in the morning glory family, but of course native to Florida, so blooming wonderfully throughout the summer. Some other ideas: lopsided Indian grass or gopher apple. Full sun ground covers. So of course we all are somewhat familiar with the sunshine mimosa or even the frog fruit. So sunshine mimosa is going to be a little bit more dry area, where the frog fruit is going to like it pretty wet. So good for like a front yard swale or drainage ditch, things like that. Of course, we have all our beautiful Florida wildflowers. So the monarda, the coreopsis, the dune sunflower, and all those. We also have our muhly grass, which is becoming more standardized, more available, nice bunching grass. And then the old mint family, the Lamiaceae. We have actually a couple native sages and mints that actually can be great ground covers, again, more for wet areas. So what about part sun? If we're just getting that 3 to 6 hours of light per day, we might want to think about, for trees, something like a fringe tree. This could be pretty sleepy most of the year, just a basic kind of green-leaved shrub or small tree. But in the springtime, it really comes to life. And same thing with the bottom pictured here, this Walter's viburnum. Most of the year just kind of looks a little standard green, little ball there, but comes to life just in the springtime with all these beautiful blooms that are loved by pollinators. We also have the Yupon holly, which you can do the weeping Yupon as well. That has a really great look, or even the star anise, which are both, which is not pictured. So if you have part sun for shrubs, we can think about, again, the beautyberry, which loads up with those berries, typically late in the fall or early winter. We have the wild hydrangea. Now, this is not your typical hydrangea coming from the north, but we do actually have a native hydrangea to Florida. You might have to dig a little deeper to get that one, but it is available. We have wild coffee, which I love. It's so versatile. It does like shade, it likes sun. So if you have kind of on the border there, that's a really good one with the berries and the flowers. And then also coral bean. So this is something we might see out in the woods or in our dune systems, great for hummingbirds, and a nice little shrub as well. And what about those shady areas? A lot of people kind of hang their head when they have shade, but we can still do a lot there. So thinking about our firebush, right? This does actually offer nectar and berries for birds and other nectar feeders. So firebush does like shade. It can also do full sun. It'll get a lot bigger, but it will exist in the shade. Needle palms, obviously not one you want to be weeding around, but once it's established, it can be very good for cover for little thrushes or other types of birds. And then of course, like we pictured before, our silver or green saw palmetto, really hardy Florida native. And what about some wet areas? So, there's a lot of benefits to integrating plants into wet areas. We're protecting our water quality, we're slowing the stormwater runoff, we're catching sediment, reducing erosion, capturing nutrients, right? Urban areas are just exporting nutrients through fertilizers, pet waste, all different types of things. So if we can buffer those areas, we're cleansing the water and capturing nutrients, that's great. And it's a wonderful area to provide habitat, right? They're already kind of coming here for the water. So if we want to also provide cover or food, that's going to be really great. And it makes it more aesthetically pleasing. If we can have some blooms around these stormwater ponds or various areas, it's just going to enhance it so much. So some things we can think about is the button bush pictured here at the top right. Cool flowers. They're little spheres, and they just have the anthers kind of sticking out, so they're really fun. And you can see it likes it very wet, very inundated. And a lot of our wet plants can also take the dry times of the year. So we're not needing to supplement with any irrigation with them, as long as they're planted in the right area. Lots of ferns, our native cinnamon fern, royal fern, they make a great ground cover for wet areas. Our sable minor, and then of course our canna lily here, gorgeous Florida native. And we want to think about where we're at for different types of species. So as we're going from the uplands down into the water, there's different plants that are more acceptable. So for our upland plants, going to be things like, the sandcord grass or the elderberry, goldenrod or bald cypress, Dahoon holly, right? All those things like it kind of wet, but they're not going to, they may or may not want to be completely inundated. Then we look at our riparian area where we start to kind of march down in towards the water. Again, the golden canna, which is the Florida canna, is going to be great. We have our blue flag iris, and some of these, I did take these from T.S. Silvaceae, another extension agent. We might have some Florida friendlies thrown in there, but a lot of these are going to be Florida natives. So the swamp milkweed, swamp hibiscus, lizard's tail, these are all great Florida natives for riparian areas. Then we have emergent plants. So this is really, they have their feet wet and their top is kind of poking out of the water. It's going to be things like our pickerel weed or giant bulrush, cattails. Those are native, but they can get a little weedy depending on how many nutrients are in the system. And then the littoral zone, so actually in the water where we have our lily pads and our maiden cane, American lotus, various things down in there. So now to wrap it up, I'm just going to provide you with some resources and some ideas about where to get these plants, right? Natives can be a little challenging. It's not like we can go to a box store or a nursery and reliably kind of get these plants. So what can we do? Well, starting off with those resources, I do have an EDIS publication that I think you'll enjoy. It's called Concepts for Sustainable Landscape Mosaics. And again, we got the QR code, but I believe they'll also put it in the chat. And this one is really great because we have a table in it. And in that table, we provide the binomial, so that, Latin name, along with the common name. Almost 100% of these are actually native plants. We give the USDA zone, which we talked about, the preferred pH, if it likes it wet, dry, sun, hard shade, or shady. And if it's going to be attracting, or if it's going to be a perennial or an annual, so living many years or maybe just living 1 year. So really great resource. And a lot of these are going to be attracting pollinators, so creating that foundation of the food web. Really great resource there. We also have our Florida Friendly Landscaping Guide to Plant Selection. So this is both a book and an app or a mobile website. This one is really good for putting in your zip code and then putting in your plant type. So if you want, and you can see here, you have a little drop down, so you can select trees or ground covers. If you want full sun or part, for shade. So you kind of let it know what your aspects are, push the button, and it gives you a full list, again, totally for free. So check those out, lots of plant options there. And there's a lot of apps in general. So you can actually learn more about bee gardening specifically, butterfly gardening. We have toxic plants and Florida friendly fertilizer ordinances going on in your area. So check out all these. We have an easy QR code there. And again, I think they'll be chatting some of that or providing the links afterwards. So where do we get plants? Well, Plant Ant can be a good option. This one, you put in your information and, it basically will tell you some information about the plant. So it's kind of a nursery and directory listing. Of course, we also have our Florida Association of Native Nurseries, which many of you may or may not know about, but this is great for finding a specific plant and, seeing where it is and what time of year you might be able to get it. And then, of course, the seeds, we pretty much come to you all with the Flora Wildflower Cooperative. This is wonderful resource here in Florida. We have to be able to purchase these seeds, and they do a great job with purity and classification. So check that out as well. And then, of course, we definitely don't want to allow invasive species in our yard. And so converting from, getting rid of all of those invasive plants, the old Wadelias, the sword ferns, the asparagus ferns, the lantanas, a lot of these are invasive. And so we definitely want to avoid them in our landscape. We have a really great book that we produced and put out called Plant This, Not That, where we talk about invasive species that you might see in your neighborhood or your landscape, your community, and preferred alternatives. So they're going to have the similar, maybe bloom color, similar shape, size. So if it's a small tree, we give you a native small tree as a substitute, really encouraging the conversion away from invasive plants and invasive species and towards more native plants, because overall, these are the ones that are supporting biodiversity, right? A lot of our invasive plants are not going to be pollinator powerhouses like our natives. They're spreading widely, and they're smothering, the vines are smothering our wilderness areas. So we can be good stewards in our urban areas to better protect our surrounding wild areas. So check that book out, Plant This, Not That. Lots of great resources online as well. We have some short videos giving you some sneak peeks into the book. And we also have our survey. So definitely, please take this survey. It has to do with what you learned today, and we're always looking to improve our class. This one was fun because it's been a little blend of what I've offered before. Sometimes I just talk about the wildlife, and then other times I just talk about the plants. So it's been fun to kind of fuse them together, and I'm always curious for your feedback. So thank you so much for doing that and for your participation. It's literally should take you a minute or two. So thank you again. And with that, I will pass it back over to the Florida Wildflower Foundation, and if there's any questions.
Thank you, Tina. That was great. We have a lot of questions, trying to parse through them a little bit here. We have a question about water oaks, and that this person, Lane, was told that they are not desirable. Are you aware of any issues with water oaks?
No, I've only heard of oaks being, challenging botanists because they do hybridize, and they're difficult to identify sometimes. But no, our water oaks should be perfectly acceptable. I would be curious if there was a scientific resource or maybe some new science on that. I don't know. Not that I'm familiar with.
I'm not aware of anything either. There's a question on the blueberries. I get this question a lot when I do talks on attracting wildlife to your landscape. How do you stop the animals from eating the plants that you're putting in?
Excellent.
Is that something we want to do?
Yeah, an excellent question. So I actually, give me 1 second. We have actually a whole series on edible landscaping, and I'm happy to pull it up. I didn't include it in the links shared today because we're not really talking about edible landscaping, but it always is a curiosity. And we have 8 publications that go along with this series, it's a really helpful series, one of which the publications talk specifically about how do we rectify this desire to have edibles, but also attract wildlife, right? We want to foster, edible landscaping and reduce food miles and support local and all that, but we also want to support wildlife. But I like my blueberries, right? So that publication actually talks about it. So I did just chat the series link. The one that I'm talking specifically about is called Rethinking Wildlife in Your Florida-Friendly Edible Landscape, and I'll chat that one directly as well. It was a really fun one to write because, yeah, it was several extension agents that really love food, right? But also want to attract wildlife and support corridors and those types of things. So how do we kind of rectify those? And it does a pretty good job of helping people navigate, those thoughts and those emotions. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any recommendations on plants to help with erosion?
A lot of our native grasses are going to be a great option for that. So the bunching grasses, Spartina, our salt marsh, marsh grass, and the muhly grass, the various types of bunching grasses. And so you can actually, if you go to that Florida Friendly app, you can search specifically for grasses for your zip code, and it'll put in a bunch of them. Once those grasses are established, their root systems are vast. So they're going to be, really stabilizing that soil, really good to prevent erosion. So definitely thinking about those.
Do you have any recommendations for preparing the ground for plants? If you need to add compost or soil or other
So
means?
it really depends on what species you're targeting. So because like we said, some of like the pawpaw, it really likes it very sandy and dry. And, you really, you don't want to add too much organic material. But if you're trying to do, other types of species, they might like it a little bit more organic material. So thinking about your species of choice, and then I would say getting a soil test. So, figuring out what the pH is and, what your target species is for ideally, and going with that. And then I think, once you start learning more about those two things, then you can kind of go from there.
Okay. Do you have any suggestions for priority plants for wildlife in Southwest Florida where there was a lot of hurricane damage?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've had a lot of changes to our state with the hurricanes, especially in that area. Again, it kind of comes down to what species you're targeting. I think starting off with the bees and the pollinators is a great start because it's manageable. It's kind of quick. You're not waiting for a tree to grow for 10 years. But so starting off with maybe the wildflowers and the high pollination plants. So some plants are going to offer more pollen to pollinators than others. And so that's why they might be more interested in those flowers. So looking at the pollinator plants that offer, a good amount of pollen, a good amount of nectar, maybe their bloom time is really long. That might be a good place to start.
Great. And then, the question just disappeared. I think one of our team answered that. I'll just end with one more question. I know we have quite a few here, and again, we can pass these on to you if you'd like to address them individually. But is there any legislation that you're aware of that might stop people from removing or cutting plants? This person is suggesting that their neighbors are cutting out the shoreline plantings and don't know what to do. Yeah,
so shorelines are actually usually have some protections around them, even if it's not a very urbanized county. There are some minimal state laws that apply. So depending on what county you're in, you might have, the state laws, but you might also have additional county laws at play with shorelines. So definitely contact your local, county public works or environmental division about that. And, if they might just refer you to the Florida Department of Environmental Protection if they don't have a local ordinance or a local program. But I could tell you definitely in Orange and Seminole counties, there are local ordinances, policies in place. Typically they do allow you to clear a small amount for an access corridor to, you know, have your jet ski or those, you know, your dock, that type of stuff. But even so, yeah, permits need to be in place and things. So contact your local county and then the DEP as well.
Great, thank you. I know there's quite a few questions about milkweed. That's not something that we're going to get into today, but we will include some resources on the native and non-native milkweed in the email that we send you. And again, we do have a really informative webinar in June coming up that will answer all of your questions and more, I promise. So please register for that. Thank you, Tina, for being here today and for providing such great information on attracting wildlife in our landscapes. We definitely need to see more of this, and appreciate all the information.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate y'all having me and for the topic, and thank you all for joining.
And remember, this will be, we'll send the link out to you in the next couple of days with the recording so you can watch it again and take all the notes of things that you missed.
Thanks,
all right, take care, everybody. We'll see you next month. Bye-bye.
Bye.